Noah, this section's for immediate family only. My uncle snapped, pointing toward a shaky chair by the exit. Several relatives laughed. Then the staff brought over the $2,900 bill and set it in front of me. I smiled, stood up, and announced, "Good thing I'm not family, then I don't need to pay." I, 26M, had always been the family punching bag, but what happened at my grandmother's funeral reception made me realize I was done being everyone's doormat. My grandmother had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. She was everything to me, the only person who ever showed me genuine love and acceptance. The rest of the family, led by my uncle, had always treated me like an unwanted burden she'd foolishly taken on. The funeral service itself had been beautiful. I'd arranged everything, from the flowers to the catering, using money from my savings account that I'd been building for years working double shifts at the warehouse. My grandmother had always wanted a proper send-off, and I was determined to give her that, even if it meant emptying my bank account. After the burial, everyone gathered at the community center I'd rented for the reception. The room buzzed with conversations about memories and condolences, but I noticed how the family naturally segregated itself. The real family, my uncle, his wife, their 2 adult children, and my grandmother's sister, had claimed the front tables near the memorial display I'd put together. They sat in their expensive clothes, looking every bit the grieving relatives they wanted everyone to think they were. I had been sitting toward the back, picking at my food and lost in memories of my grandmother, when my uncle suddenly stood up. His voice carried across the room as he announced that they needed to rearrange the seating for family photos. He pointed directly at me and told me that the section I was in was for immediate family only. His finger then gestured toward a wobbly folding chair by the exit, the kind they use for extra seating when they run out of proper chairs. The room fell silent for a moment before several relatives started chuckling. My cousin smirked and made a comment about how I should know my place by now. My uncle's wife nodded approvingly, as if justice was finally being served. The other guests, neighbors and family friends who had known my grandmother for decades, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I felt my face burn with humiliation as I stood up slowly. This wasn't the first time they'd made it clear I wasn't really family, but doing it at my grandmother's funeral, in front of everyone who knew how much she loved me, was a new low even for them. I walked over to the rickety chair by the exit and sat down, my hands shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. My grandmother would have been horrified. She'd always told me that family wasn't about blood, it was about love and loyalty. She'd made it clear in every conversation we'd had that I was her grandson, period. The reception continued around me, but I felt completely isolated. People kept glancing over at me with pity, which somehow made everything worse. I watched my uncle hold court at the main table, accepting condolences and telling stories about his mother as if he'd been the devoted son instead of the man who'd visited maybe twice a year and always left early. About an hour later, the catering staff approached our section with a leather folder. I watched them scan the room, clearly looking for whoever was in charge of payment. My uncle noticed them first and immediately pointed in my direction, telling them I was handling all the arrangements and payment. The staff member, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, walked over to my exile chair by the exit. She apologized for interrupting and explained that the final bill was ready if I wanted to review it. She handed me the folder, and I opened it to find a detailed invoice totaling $2,900. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known it would be expensive, but seeing it in black and white made the reality sink in. This was money I'd saved for 2 years, working overtime whenever I could get it. Money I'd planned to use for a down payment on a small apartment so I could finally move out of the studio I'd been renting since college. I stared at the bill for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me. The grief was still there, crushing and overwhelming, but underneath it was a cold anger that seemed to crystallize everything into perfect clarity. I stood up slowly, still holding the bill, and walked back toward the main table where my uncle and his family were still entertaining guests. The room gradually quieted as people noticed me approaching with the invoice in my hand. My uncle looked up at me with barely concealed irritation, probably annoyed that I was interrupting his performance as the grieving son. He asked if there was a problem, his tone suggesting that whatever it was, I should handle it quietly and not disturb the important people. I smiled at him, feeling genuinely calm for the first time all day. I told him there was no problem at all, just a small misunderstanding that needed clearing up. I explained that since I wasn't immediate family, as he'd made abundantly clear in front of everyone, I obviously couldn't be expected to pay for a family event. The color drained from his face as the implications hit him. His wife's mouth fell open, and my cousin suddenly looked very interested in his plate. The other guests had started paying attention now, sensing drama brewing. I continued, keeping my voice pleasant and conversational. I mentioned how grateful I was that he'd reminded everyone of my non-family status, because it meant I could leave the bill with the actual immediate family where it belonged. After all, it wouldn't be appropriate for a non-family member to take on such an important responsibility. My uncle started to stammer something about misunderstandings and not meaning it that way, but I cut him off gently. I told him I completely understood his position and respected his need to maintain proper family boundaries. I set the bill down on the table in front of him and stepped back. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was staring at my uncle, waiting to see what he would do. His face had gone from pale to red as he realized he was trapped by his own words. If he tried to make me pay now, he'd look like exactly the petty, cruel man he was. If he paid it himself, he'd be out nearly $3,000 he clearly hadn't planned to spend. His wife leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear, probably about their credit card limits. My cousin looked like he wanted to disappear under the table. The other relatives who had laughed earlier were now studying their hands with intense concentration. I thanked everyone for such a memorable reception and told them I was sure my grandmother would have been proud of how her immediate family handled everything. I mentioned that I had some personal items of hers to collect from her house, but I'd coordinate with them since, as non-family, I wouldn't want to overstep any boundaries. As I walked toward the exit, I could hear urgent whispered conversations breaking out behind me. Someone asked if anyone had cash, while another voice wondered if the caterers would take a payment plan. My uncle was trying to quietly negotiate with the staff, his earlier bluster completely gone. I paused at the door and looked back one more time. The memorial display I'd created, filled with photos I'd collected and arranged, flowers I'd chosen, and a memory book I'd put together, stood as a testament to the grandmother who had loved me unconditionally. These people hadn't contributed a single photo or shared memory for the display, yet they'd been ready to take credit for everything while treating me like an outsider. The drive home was surreal. I felt lighter somehow, despite the grief that was still crushing my chest. For the first time in my adult life, I'd stood up to them. I'd used their own cruelty against them, and it felt like justice. Update 1. The phone started ringing that evening. First it was my cousin, trying to play peacemaker. He insisted it had all been a big misunderstanding and that nobody meant to hurt my feelings. He suggested we could split the cost of the reception, which was rich considering he'd been one of the people laughing when I got banished to the exile chair. I told him I appreciated his concern, but as a non-family member, I didn't feel comfortable getting involved in family financial decisions. I suggested he talk to his father about payment arrangements. Next was my uncle's wife, and she was furious. She accused me of being petty and disrespectful at such a difficult time. She said my grandmother would be ashamed of my behavior and that I was tearing the family apart over money. I listened to her rant for a few minutes before calmly explaining that I was simply respecting the boundaries they'd established. If I wasn't family enough to sit with them, I wasn't family enough to pay their bills. I told her my grandmother had taught me about consistency and following through on your words, lessons that seemed especially relevant now. The calls continued for the next few days. Various relatives tried different approaches: guilt, anger, appeals to family loyalty. The irony wasn't lost on me that suddenly everyone was very concerned about family unity. My uncle finally called personally on Thursday evening. His tone was different now, almost pleading. He explained that they couldn't afford the catering bill and asked if we could work something out. He mentioned that his wife had been stress eating since Sunday and his son was asking for money for his own bills. I told him I was sorry to hear about their financial difficulties, but as he'd made clear, this wasn't my responsibility. I suggested he contact the catering company to discuss payment plans or perhaps reach out to other family members who might be willing to help. Update 2. By the following week, word had spread through my grandmother's social circle about what happened at the reception. Several of her longtime friends reached out to me, and their reactions were unanimous. They were appalled by how I'd been treated. One of her bridge club friends told me she'd confronted my uncle at the grocery store and given him a piece of her mind about his behavior. Another mentioned that several people had been talking about it at church, and the consensus wasn't favorable toward my uncle's family. My grandmother's neighbor, an elderly woman who'd known our family for 20 years, called to tell me something that changed everything. She said my grandmother had been worried about exactly this kind of treatment and had taken steps to protect me. Apparently, my grandmother had updated her will 6 months before she died. She'd left her house to me, along with most of her personal possessions. The only thing she'd left to my uncle were some family photos and a small amount of cash, about enough to cover the catering bill, ironically. The neighbor urged me to contact my grandmother's lawyer, saying there were things I needed to know about the will that my uncle's family might not be sharing with me. I called the lawyer the next morning. The conversation was enlightening, to say the least. My grandmother had indeed left me her house, which was worth significantly more than I'd realized. She'd also left detailed instructions about her funeral arrangements and had specifically set aside money to pay for them, money that was supposed to come from her estate before any other distributions. The lawyer explained that my uncle, as the executor, should have informed me about these provisions immediately after the funeral. Instead, he'd apparently been hoping to use the funeral expenses to reduce the overall value of the estate, giving himself access to more of the remaining assets. I asked the lawyer to schedule a formal reading of the will and to ensure all beneficiaries were present. It was time for some transparency about my grandmother's actual wishes. Update 3. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at the lawyer's office. I arrived early and watched as my uncle's family filed in, looking distinctly uncomfortable. They'd clearly been hoping to handle the estate quietly, without any formal proceedings. The lawyer began by explaining my grandmother's mental state when she'd updated the will. She'd been completely lucid and had specifically requested that her decisions be clearly documented to prevent any family disputes. She'd also left a personal letter to be read as part of the proceedings. The letter was devastating in its clarity. My grandmother had written about her disappointment in how her son's family treated me, despite my devotion to her. She'd observed the subtle cruelties and exclusions over the years and had decided to ensure I'd be taken care of after she was gone. She'd left me the house, her car, most of her jewelry, and several savings accounts I didn't even know existed. She'd also specifically mentioned the funeral arrangements, stating that she'd set aside $5,000 to cover all expenses, with any remainder going to me as well. My uncle's face went through several color changes as the lawyer read through the bequests. His family had been left some personal items and a total of about $3,000, almost exactly what they'd ended up paying for the reception. The lawyer then handed me an envelope containing keys to the house and safe deposit box, along with bank account information. My grandmother had essentially ensured that I'd never have to worry about rent again and would have a solid foundation to build my future on. As we left the lawyer's office, my uncle tried one last time to smooth things over. He suggested we could work together to sell the house and split the proceeds, claiming it's what family would do. I looked at him for a long moment, remembering all the years of subtle insults and exclusions, culminating in that humiliating moment at the funeral reception. Then I smiled and told him that sounded like a conversation he should have with his family. After all, as he'd made perfectly clear, I wasn't really family. And honestly, after everything that had happened, I was grateful for that distinction. My grandmother had seen everything clearly and had made her choices accordingly. She'd loved me enough to protect me from the people who should have been my support system, but had chosen to be my tormentors instead. I drove to her house, my house now, and sat in the driveway for a while, thinking about the woman who'd raised me with such wisdom and love. She taught me that real family isn't about blood or obligation, but about genuine care and respect. She'd also taught me, apparently, that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people face the consequences of their own choices. The house felt different now that I knew it was mine. It felt like the home it had always been, but also like a new beginning. I had options now, security I'd never imagined possible. I could keep the house and finally have the stability I'd always craved, or I could sell it and use the money to build something entirely new. Either way, I was free from the people who'd spent years making me feel like I didn't belong anywhere. My grandmother had given me more than just financial security. She'd given me proof that I had been loved and valued, and the confidence to demand that same respect from others going forward. The irony wasn't lost on me that my uncle's cruel display at the funeral had ultimately backfired spectacularly. If he'd just treated me with basic decency, I might have felt obligated to share my inheritance or help them financially in the future. Instead, his actions had crystallized exactly why my grandmother had made the choices she did. Sometimes the best lesson someone can teach you is exactly who they really are. And sometimes, the best response is simply to believe them.